Welcome to another brand new explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the massive, high-stakes geopolitical battle for the future of electric vehicles. And, this really isn't just about cars anymore. We're talking about a complete tectonic shift in global power, manufacturing, and technology. So let's get right into the context. Okay, let's dive into this. For the literal first time in history, in 2025, an American company did not sell the most electric vehicles on Earth. A Chinese company actually pulled it off. BYD sold a staggering 2.26 million battery electric vehicles worldwide, and that officially blew right past Tesla's 1.64 million. Look, for over a decade, the whole world basically assumed that the electric car revolution belonged entirely to Silicon Valley. But this huge 2025 turning point, it completely shatters that assumption.
And we really need to understand that this didn't just happen overnight by accident. It wasn't simply the result of intellectual property theft, which you hear a lot from some commentators. What we're actually looking at here is a deliberate, massive paradigm shift in global manufacturing. It's the payoff of 20 years of razor-sharp industrial strategy, wild price competition, and a level of supply chain integration that frankly doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet right now.
So here's our visual roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start off with the two different master plans, then move into the hidden battery battlefield, drill down into mining and refining monopolies, look at the new tariff walls, and finally wrap up with the road ahead. Let's jump in. Section 1. Two different master plans. 20 years of strategy versus policy whiplash. Getting a handle on this vastly different history between Beijing and Washington is absolutely key to understanding the cars hitting the streets right now. Just look at this uninterrupted two-decade master plan. Back in 2001, Chinese planners made a massive calculated bet. They basically knew they couldn't catch up to the West when it came to traditional internal combustion engines, right? So they decided to just skip that fight entirely and go all in on dominating the electric drivetrain. By 2009, they're rolling out these massive subsidy programs, which drove consumer demand and essentially forced legacy automakers to start building EVs. Through the 2010s, they heavily subsidized the entire battery supply chain. But here's where it gets super interesting. In 2019, Beijing actually intentionally pulled back those direct purchase subsidies. Why would they do that? Well, to force the weaker automakers to either consolidate or fail. It was survival of the fittest, leaving only these massive, battle-hardened giants standing.
Now, contrast that incredibly steady timeline with America's structural hurdles. The US actually had a huge head start with companies like Tesla, for sure, but they faced massive policy whiplash. For example, EV tax credits have wildly swung back and forth between different administrations, dramatically expanding at times and then abruptly ending in 2025 under new tax and spending laws. On top of that, the US has a pretty fragmented domestic supply base, and it usually takes 3 to 5 years just to get a factory permitted. Over in China, less than 2 years. Oh, and it's absolutely worth mentioning that there's still a really fierce, totally unresolved debate among economists about what's actually happening here. Some argue China's massive manufacturing footprint is unfair dumping, driven by state overcapacity, while others say, hey, this is just the natural result of brutal efficiency, vertical integration, and genuine scale. Section 2. The hidden battery battlefield, where the real war is waged. Okay, so we're going to shift our focus away from the shiny cars themselves and look directly at the literal guts of the industry, the batteries.
And this brilliantly illustrates the huge divergence in strategy. For years, there's been this massive fight for dominance between two battery chemistries. Now, Western automakers largely assumed NMC, which stands for nickel manganese cobalt, was the only real viable future. Why? Because it packs way more energy for a longer range. The downside is it relies on really expensive and controversial minerals like cobalt. But China, they made a totally different strategic bet on LFP, or lithium iron phosphate. Now, LFP is cheaper, it's safer, and it lasts a lot longer. Historically, it did suffer from lower range, but clever engineering by Chinese firms totally closed that gap. And today, LFP is absolutely dominating their domestic market, and we're even seeing it find its way into entry-level Western models.
If you want to see the staggering reality of that bet, just look at this. In the 2025 global EV battery market, one single Chinese company, CAT, supplies roughly 39% of the entire market. That means nearly 2 out of every 5 electric vehicle batteries installed anywhere on Earth, no matter what brand a car is, come from this one single manufacturer. Literally mind-blowing. Which actually brings us to a major myth we need to bust right now. You'll hear people say China's lead is purely the result of endless government subsidies, and that their cars just couldn't compete otherwise. Well, while subsidies were definitely a massive deal in the early days,
Independent analysts basically all agree today that the current reality is totally different. It's unprecedented scale and brutal vertical integration. Basically, these companies are making their own cells, their own chips, their own drivetrain hardware. That, combined with massive battery cost advantages, is what's actually driving the crazy price gap we see today. Section 3. Mining and refining monopolies, the bottom of the supply chain. To really grasp that vertical integration, we've got to dig even deeper, literally down into the raw earth. When you look at the supply chain steps here, what's really interesting is the specific choke point at step 2. Sure, the raw ore comes from all over the place, from Australia to Chile to the Democratic Republic of Congo. But the absolutely crucial step of refining those raw rocks into battery-grade chemicals, that is heavily, heavily dominated by China. Even if the rock is pulled straight from a South American salt flat, it almost certainly passes through a Chinese-owned refinery before it ever becomes a battery. So just how dominant are they in refining? Try 90%. Roughly 90% of the entire world's rare earth refining capacity is sitting right in China. And these refined elements aren't optional. They are completely mandatory for the permanent magnets used in EV motors. This near monopoly on refining is arguably the single most durable pillar of their whole EV advantage. Why? Because building competing refining infrastructure from scratch takes insane amounts of capital, and it takes years just to get the permits and build the facilities. Section 4. The new tariff walls. The world splits in two. Bringing this whole narrative right up to the present day, this overwhelming supply chain dominance has triggered a wildly intense geopolitical reaction. So, the crucial point is right here, 100%. In 2024, the United States slapped a 100% Section 301 tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles. And honestly, when you stack that with other duties, the effective tariff actually pushes way past 110%. In practical terms, this completely seals Chinese brand EVs out of the American market. A car that costs $22,000 globally would suddenly cost over $60,000 by the time it actually hits an American lot. No way anyone's buying that. When you zoom out and look at the globe, you see 3 totally different strategies for handling this massive influx of cars. The USA, like we said, has opted for a total lockout with those 100+% tariffs. Then you have the European Union, taking a much more calibrated approach. They're adding variable tariffs up to 35.3%, and they're negotiating minimum price floors. They want to manage the competition, not completely destroy it. And finally, you have the global south, places like Latin America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. They've largely kept their markets completely open. And as a result, that is exactly where Chinese manufacturers are seeing absolutely massive export growth as they pivot away from those locked-out Western markets. But as these cars flood global markets, there's another myth that's quickly dying out. People used to think that a cheap Chinese car automatically meant an unsafe car. Well, that's just no longer true. Independent crash testing by European and domestic safety boards has actually shown several models achieving extremely high safety ratings that are entirely comparable to Western legacy automakers. The quality has fundamentally leveled up. Low cost simply does not equal low safety anymore. Section 5. The road ahead. How the race could change. Okay, so we've seen how the board is set up today, but how on earth might this current paradigm be completely upended tomorrow? Let's take a look at the road ahead. Industry analysts are pointing to 3 plausible paths forward here. Scenario 1. Chinese manufacturers just bypass those tariff walls entirely by building local factories right inside Europe, Latin America, and eventually North America. Scenario 2. The US kind of just accepts being outpriced on budget passenger EVs, but they pivot and leverage their massive tech sector to completely dominate advanced autonomous driving and highly specialized electric trucks. And then there's Scenario 3. The ultimate wild card, a breakthrough in solid-state batteries. Look, if anyone reaches mass commercialization of solid-state tech, which promises drastically higher energy density and way better safety without using liquid electrolytes, it could instantly reset this entire board and completely rewrite the rules of the race. So the EV race is far from a finished story. It is a daily, constantly shifting battle involving massive global tariffs, deep earth mining, and cutting-edge software. And I really want to leave you with this provocative question to chew on. As combustion engines fade into the rearview mirror, who will ultimately control the 21st century's industrial and energy foundation? Well, I hope you enjoyed this explainer. Drop a comment below with what topic you want us to explore next. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Keep watching, keep learning.